Well, thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much, everybody who's managed to join us this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you are in the world. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cough, so if you hear that, I'll really apologise for that. Assistive technology and inclusive classroom. What does that mean? What is an inclusive classroom, really? Today, hopefully, we're going to have a look at a whole range of assistive technology and how it's used as part of young people's education. I'm actually using an assistive technology device right now. I have a telephone from the RNID, which is the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. I have a very severe hearing impairment, and my phone allows me to adjust the volume and the tone and everything else to make it more appropriate for me to be able to hear people's conversations. Assistive technology is just that. It's technology which facilitates people's independence. I'm going to move the slide on. I'd like you to have a quick look at this slide. For me, assistive technology breaks down into three key areas, really, and that's physical access, and that's by and large the devices themselves. So by physical access, we might mean things like switches for people who have limited movement, joysticks, roller balls, touch screens, the kind of equipment that you're used to seeing in classrooms of people with who have difficulties accessing things. The second strand is cognitive access, and that's by and large to do with differentiation, and we'll talk a little bit about that more as we go through. Cognitive access by and large means software or devices which are designed to be easier to use. For example, there may be a cause and effect software that you use which is at a cognitive level of somebody who's just beginning to understand their world. The third strand is supportive access, and many of you have experience of this. This is software tools like Read and Write, or some of the Don Johnson tools where we might use phonetic word processors and things like this. They support somebody's access, and they're all scaffolds, really. They're things that we can add in or take away depending upon the needs of the user themselves. Without it, many of our students would struggle to interact with technology and to interact with the curriculum that we're trying to teach. So it's important for us as educators that we have an understanding of what that technology does, who it's for, who would get benefit most from using it, and ways in which we can use it, which are not about the technology themselves. They're about helping us to deliver what it is that we want to deliver, whether that's our curriculum, whether it's the way that we're the communication needs of the person that we're working with, or indeed their leisure needs too, and that's something else that we'll look at as we go along. Let's just have a quick look at the kind of technology we would see typically in people's classrooms. By and large, you'd find it difficult to go into anybody's classroom these days and not see an interactive whiteboard. I guess that's the same in the US as it is in the UK. Interactive whiteboards are great. They're by and large huge, big touch screens, really, and certainly a lot of the children that we work with, they're very, very useful. Largely because they help to bridge the gap between the very concrete things that we do with our hands and the really quite abstract things that we do with technology. Interactive whiteboards, by and large, we see those everywhere. Touch monitors, very common in schools these days. iPads too. I think you struggle again to find a school that doesn't have at least one of those. Other types of technology we see are keyboards, large keyboards for people who might have motor difficulties, people who have difficulty in seeing, or even just young children who are just learning to use a keyboard. I always find it really, really striking that we suddenly expect children as young as 3 and 4 to be able to use a keyboard without any adaptation at all. And there are lots of different keyboards. I'll talk about those too. Pointing devices, many of those we see are in schools too. Everybody pretty much uses a mouse, but for some there are difficulties with that, and they may well use a trackball or a roller ball or a joystick, or even things like a head mouse, where the mouse pointer is controlled by moving your head around, or even quite sophisticated systems like eye gaze systems, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we go through. Switches, very common in schools in special education schools where children have physical and cognitive difficulties. Switches are quite easy to use initially, but very difficult to use once we get beyond basic cause and effect. Communication devices, and lots of people use those, things like the Big Mac and message sequencing devices. Then more abstract things like symbols. I'm sure many of you use symbols in your school or in your classroom, and we use them for lots of different reasons. To support literacy for some, to support communication concepts for others, as part of visual timetabling and helping somebody understand the flow of time and the organisation of their day. And then quite sophisticated tools like screen magnifiers, technology which will read documents for people, phonetic spell checking. All of this stuff we see in classrooms around the country and around the world, and they all by and large you need to know about them. The difficulty, of course, is how do you find out about them? How do you get information about these things? And hopefully that's one of the things we can address. I'm just going to move to the next slide. We look at each of these technologies separately and just examine a little bit about how they're used and who uses them. We'll start with touch technology. Touch technology covers interactive whiteboards, touch screens, iPads, all of those things. And it is, by and large, the simplest way to interact with a computer. As a baby, we'll reach out and touch things. You know, we learn how to touch things before we learn how to speak. And cognitively, it's the simplest way for anybody to interact with a computer. I put on my slide size is important, and it is important. If you imagine that we're working with a quite small screen, the level of fine motor control that people need in order to be able to touch things ramps up the smaller the screen gets. So it is important that if we're going to use touch technology, that actually we use a screen that's big enough not only for the person to be able to see, but for them to be able to actually target and touch the things that they need to touch. You can adapt touch technology to work a little bit more in the way that we want to work with children. Certainly touch monitors and touch screens allow us to... Oh, right, sorry, somebody's asking a question. I'll just answer it quickly while I'm on there. That particular interactive whiteboard can be moved up and down, sorry, yes, yeah. The way that touch screens work is, by and large, when we touch them, it tells the computer that you click the mouse there. So by and large, anything at all that you use that will work with a mouse will work with a touch screen. There's this fallacy that interactive whiteboard software has to be something special, and it's not. By and large, it will certainly work with anything else, any kind of software that you would use. You can change the way that the touch screen works, and this is very, very important, certainly for younger people and for people with intellectual difficulties who might put their hands on the screen but not take it off. Certainly one of those settings you'll see inside the settings is click on release. So basically what happens is it clicks the mouse when the person takes their hands off the screen rather than when their fingers actually touch it. And that can be really quite useful for some people. The other issue with touch technology, of course, is that we often see people using touch technology and certainly touch screens who really shouldn't be. And I know you're going to get cross with me for saying that, but it's true. What tends to happen with touch technology is we'll start with somebody who has quite a severe, quite a complex difficulty. We'll present them with a touch screen. will help them understand that by touching it they can make something happen, and they will, and that's great. But from a point of view of progression, how do we move that person on? And really, our goal with touch technology is that that young person is able to make a choice by choosing what to touch. And if they're not able to do that, then really that's the wrong technology for them. And the kind of young person that I'm thinking about, and the person I've got in the back of my mind, is somebody with cerebral palsy. Often we see young people with cerebral palsy using touchscreens, and their targeting is really quite poor. Their hands come out, and it's by and large they're slapping the screen rather than actually touching it. I have a very, very simple maxim really with touch technology, and that is, if you imagine the screen was split into four quadrants, and if that young person was able to touch each of those four quadrants, so if I put an object in the top right-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner, and that person was able to touch that, I'd be confident then to think, well, that person will very likely be able to move on and be able to use that technology to make choices. If they're not able to do that, then I think we need to look at something else. I'm just going to move the slide. Oh, I don't have a slide on my screen. Oh, there we go. I mentioned interactive whiteboards, and there have been quite a revolution in some schools, helping to bridge this gap between the very concrete things and the abstract things. I'll explain that a little bit. If you imagine a child is sorting objects out on the table, we might have some red things, some blue things, and some green things, and we can put the red things into the red bag, and the blue things in the blue bag, and the green things in the green bag. And that's all very concrete, and I'm doing it with my hands, and it engages all different parts of my brain doing that. When I do it with a computer, though, I'm sat with a mouse, and I'm moving an object on the desk, and clicking some things which represent real things. And for some people, that's quite a step cognitively to understand. But if I can get hold of a green thing on the screen and move it with my hand and put it into a green sack, that bridges that gap between what I've been doing on the table and what I'm doing on the computer. They are great in that respect. There are some severe downsides to using them too. And I visit many, many, many schools and see lots of children using interactive whiteboards that really shouldn't. These are the children with cerebral palsy who can't get their arms out to touch things. The screen's far too big for them to be able to see. They're positioned sideways because their head's at an odd angle. And usually somebody will give them a tapper, a bopper, or whatever it is that they call it in their school. It usually means a piece of cardboard tube or a piece of stick or some piece of plastic that person can bang the screen with. Sounds great. In one sense, yes, that person's included, but are they really included? Is there a better way to do that? Certainly in an inclusive classroom, if that person couldn't touch an interactive whiteboard in a way which is meaningful to them, surely there's a better way. Maybe we could use switches with that person. And assuming that the software that we're using works with switches too, then it doesn't really matter that that person can't get up and take their turn on the interactive whiteboard. They may well want to, but from a point of view of teaching and learning, it may well be better to keep them sat in their chair and use their switches to take turns. And I'm thinking of a young child that I used to teach who was a very good two-switch step scanner. But when it was her turn on interactive whiteboard, she got a piece of cardboard tubing and used to bang the screen. In one sense, with switches, an independent learner, away on the interactive whiteboard, we took all of that away from her and gave her a piece of stick to bang something with no real understanding about what was going on. As I mentioned, touchscreens are quite easy to use. Sometimes they're too easy, and it's difficult sometimes to move students on. So we need to be very careful about how we approach the use of touchscreens. iPads are quite new, and they're pretty much ubiquitous now in schools, and we're already starting to see some fantastic outcomes with iPads. I would only say this, that we really need to be cautious about who we're giving them to. and not forget people's individual needs. I was at the school last week where I saw a young person with cerebral palsy with an iPad who could barely keep it on their knee and could just about manage to bang it. Now I know this would never happen in any of your schools, but it happens. And when I asked the colleague in the school why they were using an iPad with that student, they said because iPads are great. And it was almost as if their common sense chip had been switched off. So please, if you're using iPads, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't, they're fantastic, and there's some really, really good applications out there. Just be aware of the person that you're using them and their individual needs. Is the iPad the right tool for them? There are some documents out there, and certainly people who use Twitter would know about this rubrics where we can match the individual needs of the student to iPad applications. And maybe I will post some of those up after this session. Okay, moving on then. Let's look at keyboards. My screen's just catching up. There are lots and lots and lots of different keyboards and different alternatives. So I'm just going to move straight to the next slide and we'll talk about what's wrong with them. I put a picture of a keyboard there. That's a bog standard, everyday Microsoft keyboard. And I'm asking a question, what's wrong with that? I've put some things there already. There are 115 keys on that keyboard. And if you press the Shift key, that's 250 combinations. My last time I looked, the alphabet had 26 letters, and there were 10 numbers, 0 to 9. And if you're learning a keyboard and how to use a keyboard, by and large, that's all you need initially. So 115 key keyboard can be quite daunting, even for just young children, let alone people who have physical and cognitive difficulties. Classic example is the Alt-GR key. I've been using keyboards for 35 years, longer probably, and I had to look it up. I didn't know what it does. I could have a special prize for anybody who knows exactly what that does. The other difficulty with them is they're often difficult to see. The example I've shown there has beige keys and uses light brown legends, and the legends don't even cover the whole of the key, so they're very, very difficult to see. The keys are often too small for some students too. They're typically about a centimetre or so square. Very difficult for small fingers or people with difficulty with their fine motor skills to be able to use. They're uppercase. They use uppercase letters, and yet we teach lowercase to very young children and to children with intellectual difficulties, and yet we expect them to transpose it. The classic example of that I saw in the school recently, where the teacher would write a sentence on the board. The teaching assistant would then write the sentence on a piece of paper for the student, who would look at the piece of paper, look at the keyboard, realise that nothing matched, and the teaching assistant would then rewrite the sentence in capital letters so the person could find it. And it still didn't work because, of course, the capital letter worked for the first letter of the sentence, but then they've got capital letters, but lowercase letters are coming up. Horribly, horribly complicated for some people. The QWERTY layout is difficult. We teach children ABC, and yet we use a keyboard that has letters mixed up in an odd way. Oh, there's a lady. There's somebody there answering my question about Alt-GR. Well done, you. There are good reasons why we might want to have a keyboard that has ABC. There is a difficulty, though, that the rest of the world doesn't use ABC keyboards. They use QWERTY layout keyboards. So it's probably not a good reason to change that. In fact, the only time I've ever come across anybody who benefited from having an ABC layout keyboard was somebody with an acquired brain injury after a stroke, who knew the letters of the alphabet and actually found some benefit in using a keyboard that was laid out in that way. There are lots of different keyboards that we see. Uppercase key. Large key keyboards, almost an inch square keyboards with that are color coded for some people can help. On the example on my slide, color codes the consonants in green. the vowels in purple, the numbers in red. And for some people that can help. For somebody with visual impairment, they would probably hate that. I can't type and talk, so I'll get back to you. Another example there is a high visibility keyboard for somebody who might have a visual impairment. On the right hand side there is a tiny compact keyboard. I remember very well my first telephone call I took when I worked at Assistive Technology was from a lady who was asking me for a left-handed keyboard, and I couldn't quite understand what she meant. She told me that the student she was working with only had a use of her left hand, and the keyboard was too big. Small compact keyboards are really useful for people who have difficulty in moving their hands, who may not have a full range of movement, or only have access to one hand. You can, of course, create your own keyboards. I bet every single one of you, if you go back to your school, open the cupboard, you'll find an IntelliKeys board. Every single school I've ever visited has one in the cupboard somewhere. They never really get used very much, but they can be really useful in creating keyboards specifically for a child. So, for example, at one level you might just have a picture of a child on the screen, and when they touch it, it types in their name into a word processor or into something like Clicker, which would then read it out. You might then go on to putting some letters underneath that child's name, and they can touch them in order and type in their name. You can create keyboards to operate talking books. You can create keyboards to operate the media player. So for a person who's able to use a keyboard, we can create keyboards specifically for them. One of the single biggest issues we have with keyboards is what we call the JJJ problem. I'm sure many of you have come across this. The JJJ problem is when Jenny starts to type a name and she gets JJJJJ, E, N, and the poor teaching assistant is going back having to delete 6 J's, and then 6 E's and 5 N's. And largely that's because the keyboard auto-repeat is set too quickly. You can change all of those settings simply by going into the control panel. If you don't know how to do that, just go onto Google and type in "My Computer, My Way." And there's a fantastic website set up by an organisation in the UK called AbilityNet. And it's quite simple. You tell it what kind of computer you've got. You tell it what the devices that you want to change, so the mouse or the keyboard or whatever it is, and what it is that you want to do, and it will print out a step-by-step guide for how you can do that. So for those of you who are not familiar with changing the settings of the operating system, that's a great way to do it. We'll move on. I mentioned the mouse, and the mouse comes under the general category of pointing devices. Every single one of us uses a pointing device. We all use a mouse when we use a computer, right? Some people use the little touch pads and things that are on their laptops, but by and large they all work in the same way. I move something around in one plane, it moves the mouse pointer around in a different one. And it's relatively easy to learn for us. But it's not for people who have physical difficulties, and it's certainly not for people who have cognitive difficulties. There's a huge leap between understanding what's happening on your hand and making the relationship between what happens on the screen. It's a very difficult thing. And it requires lots of practice. When I talk about practice, I mean fun practice. I don't mean practice while you're doing your maths, because doing your maths introduces an additional cognitive load, which means I can't really concentrate on learning to use the mouse because my teacher's asking me to concentrate on learning to do maths. So you need to look for simple, fun games which you can use to practice the mouse. For those people who are not aware of it, there's a great website called Help Kids Learn. I could give you the URL, but just type in Help Kids Learn, but it's kids with a Z. So it's not helping kids learn to write the word kids. And there's some lovely mouse programs on there that we can use to do that. There are lots of other alternatives to the mouse. There are rollerballs. Rollerballs are much easier to use than a mouse, largely because they stay on your desk. A mouse can move anywhere on your desk, and I'm sure many of us can remember our colleagues stretching their arms out right to the very edge of their desk because they hadn't thought to pick the mouse up and move it back again. Rollerballs, joysticks, stay put. You put them on the centre of your desk and it moves around. So basically you're just moving the pointer. You're just moving the pointer rather than having to move the device itself. Certainly for people with cerebral palsy, that can really, really help because it doesn't move in 3 dimensions. There are more sophisticated solutions, and I mentioned them earlier. Head pointing systems. This is where we might put a tiny little reflective dot either on the person's glasses, their spectacles, or onto a baseball cap, or even onto their forehead if they let them get away with it. And that's picked up by a special device which converts their head movements into mouse pointer movements. And then they can then either click the mouse by pressing a switch or by dwelling. By dwelling I mean keeping the mouse pointer still for a set length of time. And they're very, 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 very successful for people who have good head control. The future, well, the future is probably eye gaze. I'm going to move the slide on. And we'll talk about eye gaze in a second. So what's wrong with a mouse? Well, it's designed for adult hands, and most of the people we work with aren't adults, unless, of course, you work with adults. It moves in 3 dimensions. In other words, you can lift it up off the table as well as up, down, left and right while it's moving on the table. It's very difficult for kids to make the connection between the mouse and the mouse pointer, and I mentioned that earlier. It's a huge cognitive leap to be able to understand that moving something on your desk is moving something on the computer screen. There are ways to help people with that, and we're busy writing a little document which I'll stick on the website when it's finished. Really, just explaining how that process works. So learning to click the mouse button first and understand the mouse button is a switch, and I press it and something will happen. And by moving the mouse, that moves the pointer. There's a lovely game on Help Kids Learn called Early Mouse Movements, which certainly would help with that. The right mouse button is a real problem for children. We click that and up pops contextual menus. So I can click the right mouse button, something pops up, I click that, and the game that I was doing, the activity that I was taking part in, is suddenly gone and I'm somewhere else. There are lots of different ways to disable the right mouse button. If you just Google that, you'll find lots of different solutions to that. There are hardware solutions if you want to do those too. A little device that you can plug in between the mouse and the keyboard as a little button to turn the mouse button on or off. You can also do it in the operating system, and for some children that's all you really need to do initially. Turn that off for a little while until they've started to get an understanding of what's happening with the mouse. Pointers moving too fast or being too small to see, they're operating systems again too. And remember, I said that you could Google "My Computer, My Way" and it'll tell you how to change all of those. You can buy very large mouse pointers to use on the computer screen. I probably wouldn't recommend it unless you had a student who specifically needed something much bigger than the operating system couldn't supply. There are lots of little mice that you can buy, and that's a good solution for children who have quite small hands. I've seen lots of them in the shape of bees, ladybirds. My favourite one, which I stole from, I borrowed from an early years setting in the UK. This lady was holding up a mouse, and it was green and the shape of a frog, and had the 2 mouse buttons were 2 frogs' eyes, and one was blinking just so you knew it was the right mouse button. And she held this up in front of a little group of children, and she said, "Children, what's this?" And they said, "It's a frog." And she said, "No, it's a mouse." Well, you can imagine. I'm not a big fan of pointing devices that look like characters, ladybirds, ladybugs, I guess in the US, or bees or frogs or any of those. I think that a mouse, like anything else, is just a means to an end. It's a tool that we use in order to interact with a computer. It shouldn't look like a bee. And for some of our children who may have maybe on the autistic spectrum, actually, they may not want to hold a bee and touch a bee, so be aware of that. I mentioned rollerballs earlier. They're great. They stay on the desk, and we can move them around with fingers. Remember that we can separate out the actions of the rollerball and the mouse buttons themselves. So, for example, if somebody's just learning how to use a rollerball, maybe we can take away the mouse button itself and use a switch. And I've often done this many times. So, child can move the rollerball and move the pointer, and then take their hand away and press the switch, and it kind of separates that out and makes it easier for children to understand. Eye gaze systems are quite new, and it's a very, very, very kind of new and emerging technology, and it's quite exciting, but it's also quite worrying too. I think it would be difficult for anybody to see an eye gaze system and not see the potential for that for people who have very, very limited movement. The user looks at the screen, very sophisticated technology within the device, picks up where their eyes are looking at, moves the mouse pointer to it, and if they keep their gaze on that particular object for a set length of time, it will automatically click the mouse pointer for them. So you can imagine for somebody who may be quadriplegic, who has very, very limited movement, how useful that would be. You could have an on-screen keyboard. You could use it to dial the phone, to send emails, to surf the web. Where it kind of falls down is that is because of its remoteness and because there's no physical link between the person and the technology themselves. We see it often. People talk about using it with cause and effect children at a very, very early level of cognition, who don't really interact with the computer at all. So they won't press a switch or they won't touch a touch screen. These are children with very, very complex needs. But we put them in front of an eye gaze system, and of course they look at the screen, and the mouse will click, and something wonderful will happen on the screen. So the child will look at the screen, which causes the mouse to click, which causes something else wonderful to happen on the screen. So the child will look at the screen. You can see where I'm going. The child's looking at the screen, the mouse is being clicked, but the child itself not actually understanding the relationship between what they're doing and what's happening on the computer. So not really understanding the causal link between those two things. So they don't really understand the cause and effect part of that. And of course, if you don't understand cause and effect, then the real difficulty comes when you try to move on. And if you don't understand that you can influence the computer, that you can change things around you, then you can't really move on until you've got a solid understanding of that. Which moves us nicely onto switches. This, I suppose, is an area where I've got lots and lots of experience, really, in the use of switch technology. I came into teaching, and by and large, the only switches we had were big old wooden things that plugged into really odd wooden toys, which, when you pressed the switch or pulled a lever or dialed 111 on a phone, a clown danced and some fairy lights came on, and it really wasn't much use for anything. These days, switches can be used to control pretty much anything on the computer. However, they would certainly be the single last choice for anybody when it comes to technology. I'd never advocate using switches with people unless it was the last choice, really. There is one exception to that, and that is where we might use switches with people with toys, and we might use switches with mains operated devices, things in the multi-sensory room, where we're using them to understand control, and they're not our main method of access. Which switch to choose? Boy, there's as many answers to that question as there are switches, I guess. What I would say is that in my understanding and my experience, which goes back a long way, that there isn't a magic formula for people. By and large, 90% of the people that you work with, a big red switch or a big switch from AbleNet will work absolutely fine for them. Two considerations. One, how big it is. Can the person actually physically target it? And two, what colour is it? Can the person physically actually see it? And is there contrast between the switch and the desk? If they need something more sophisticated than that, I would suggest that you take advice from other people. Every school district has somebody in their school district who knows about, who can perform that assessment for them. Which brings us nicely onto things like mounting and positioning. Those are certainly issues which they would be able to help you with. What we're looking for when we mount a switch and when we choose a switch is positioning in a way which the person can use it, which doesn't cause them any discomfort, which is consistent in the sense that they're able to do it today and tomorrow and the day after, and it's repeatable in the sense that they can press it more than once. It's great if we can rig up a switch by somebody's head and they can press it 2 or 3 times, but then they're completely tired and not able to do that ever again for the rest of the day. We would want to look for a different switch position. So, looking for repeatability, looking for a position which doesn't cause discomfort, and looking for a position which is consistent. Lots and lots and lots of teachers I meet go home in a night and they beat themselves up because they haven't been able to set up a switch for somebody because they're working with a child who has very severe cerebral palsy, and they've tried every switch position they can, and it's not worked for them. And they go home and they get very cross with themselves that haven't been able to do that. I just want to say that that's okay. That there are some children right now, today, maybe in your class, that they're not going to be able to press a switch just now. That's not where they are. And A, don't beat yourself up about it, and B, look at the child and try and think of another way to do that. There's a lovely example. I was at a college a couple of weeks ago, and there's a young man there, and his teacher was saying to me he'd spent best part of 3 months every session with this young person trying to identify a switch position. Hadn't been able to do it, and I was asking my advice. And just looking at this child, looking at their range of movements, it was obvious that this person, there wasn't a switch position which was consistent, which didn't cause him any discomfort, and which he could press repeatedly at that point in time. So I asked him, well, what outside of the computer room, how then does this person interact with other people? And he said, well, he's a great eye pointer. So within 5 minutes, we'd set up exactly the same activity that he was using with the switch, but we'd set it up on an E-tran frame. So a young person could look at the frame to choose what he wanted, and somebody else helped him to press the switch. And straight away, he's fully engaged with what's happening, and he's integrated it into that lesson in a way which is meaningful for him. And of course, for that young person, it's great. For his teacher, he could go home that night and think, well, actually, it really doesn't matter that we haven't got a switch position for him just now. I'm putting the bottom of my slide there, switch progression roadmap. I put that there largely because if you go to inclusive.co.uk and look at the publications page, you can download a free switch progression roadmap document from there, which I wrote a couple of months ago, and tries to detail what the progression of switches are and how a person might learn to use a switch, and give you some tools to be able to do that, plus some mechanisms for assessing and recording that person's progress in there. The website would be www.inclusive.co.uk and look for publications. It's free and download it. There is an American version too, I think. If you're going to use switches, don't confine yourself to the computer. Everybody seems to connect their switches up to their computer, but there's so many other ways that you can use them. There's some fantastic toys out there that you connect them. I've put the picture of the dinosaur there from AbleNet. I love that dinosaur. Everywhere I go, kids love interacting with it. It's a great toy. But you can plug it into pretty much any toy that can be operated by batteries. And you can plug them into pretty much anything that can be operated by batteries. And I've seen some wonderful things: switch-operated iPods, switch-operated liquidizers, and things like that. With a power link, of course, you can connect it to anything that can be run from mains electricity. So the liquidizer is great. We can use the switch to create smoothies. What better way of understanding cause and effect than to actually create something that we can eat and we can drink? The whole thing which underpins switch use is not that my student can press a switch and make something happen. That's great. It's about, can my student press a switch and understand that they're doing it, and can I see them doing that in a range of different situations? So are they generalizing the use of a switch? One of the best ways to get switch use into your classroom is a good old friend, our Big Mac, without a shadow of a doubt. Big Mac will get you able to use switches right across anything you're doing in your classroom. So if you're saying hello in the morning, you can record hello and everybody can take a turn. If you're singing songs, you can put repeated words from the songs. If you're telling a story, maybe there's repeated words in the story. I'm thinking of Fee, Fi, Fo, Fum from Jack and the Beanstalk. Or alternatively, if a child's not at that level and you're telling a story about the farm, why not put some farm animal noises on there? There are a million ways to use a Big Mac, which will encourage and include a child who uses switches in everything that you do. And I wouldn't just limit yourself to the child who uses switches. If you're saying hello with a Big Mac switch, pass it round, let everybody else have a go. So they're great. They also have a little socket on the side, which is very, very, very useful. And that allows you to plug another switch into the side. So if you've got a student who's using a head switch or any of those kind of things, you'll certainly be able to use it in that same way. Big Mac switch is fantastic. Just to answer your question, a switch can be used on pretty much any toy that can work with that works with batteries. It may need to be adapted. And AbleNet do some lovely little battery adapters. You just need a pair of scissors, open the box where the batteries are, slide the adapter between the battery and the connection, and screw the box back up again. And pretty much any toy can be converted. Just need to be careful with those that use things like squeezing somebody's paw or any of those things. Okay. So all of this stuff in our classroom. There's some things we need to think about. We need to make sure that the environment that we're working in actually supports all of this stuff. So we've got room for touch screens and we've got room for rollerballs and things. I often see computers squashed onto tiny little trolleys, and of course there's no room to do anything on there. When we look at engineering the environment, that includes using things like symbols, using single message communicators in the things that we do, thinking about how we embed that technology into what we do. I mentioned earlier about the interactive whiteboard and the child banging the interactive whiteboard with a stick. That was what I would call using a technology in a way which isn't particularly meaningful. For me, if technology is to be used in an effective way, the child has to understand why it's there, and so it has to be meaningful to them. It's not just a case of tokenism. We're doing it because because we've got a bit of technology in the classroom. So we need to think about our environment. We need to choose the appropriate technology, and for some children that means that for some schools that might mean doing an access audit. We've done these in lots of schools, and that's by and large just talking to the teachers and talking about their students and what it is that person uses in order to access the computer, so that we know that. And then looking at the software that we use, always an issue. I used to be really proud of myself. I could have a class full of children. They'd all be busy doing stuff. I'd have some people using a touch monitor, and they'd be using a program called Touch Games and touching things on the screen. Then I'd be another group of children using a rollerball, and they would be using mouse skills. Another group of children using Switch It Farm, and pressing switches. And I'm supposed to be teaching history, which isn't a great thing, really. So thinking about the kind of software that we use and ensuring that software works with lots of different access devices. If it's a touch screen, it will work. If it's for an interactive whiteboard, it will work. If it's for a switch, sometimes it needs something different. So look at this kind of software that you're choosing and make sure that it works with switches and touch screens and interactive whiteboards and all of those things. Just to answer that lady's question about battery devices, we've got a session coming up, I think in a couple of months, where we're talking specifically about using switches away from the computer. So there'll be lots of examples of that. Bear in mind, all of this stuff requires some training. How do your staff and the people you work with get the time to do that? And it's an issue which is always a difficult one for colleagues in school, keeping oneself up to date with the technology that we're using in school and thinking about how we embed it. I want to just kind of roll towards our finish, really, by talking about how the technology actually impacts what we do in school, and I'm going to do that by taking you through kind of 4 scenarios, and the first one we'll start with is, I'm just waiting for my screen to update, is Chris and Stephen. Chris and Stephen are 2 children I used to teach, and they're both in the same class. And you can see that from a level of their sort of cognition, from a level of their teaching and learning, they're at completely different levels. Stephen is at the cause and effect level. He's just learning to understand that if I press a switch, I can make something happen, and you can see he's taking the utmost pleasure in operating that little switch adapted elephant. Chris, on the other hand, is quite an able young man who has Down syndrome. He's able to word process to a level. He uses an AlphaSmart device which he can connect to the computer himself and transfer his files. He can then edit them in Word. But from our point of view as educators, we have all of those children in the same class. And it's very, very difficult for us to be able to teach in a way which actually is meaningful for both groups. And technology can help us do that. You can see that with Chris, we're using the AlphaSmart. He used to take that home with him. It was his homeschool diary. I guess these days we'd probably use iPads to do that. But the technology can facilitate that level of differentiation for us. It can also help us produce age-appropriate resources. I'm not sure how many of you guys work with adults or with older learners. The question we're forever being asked is, why can't we have a counting songs program for people who are 14 or 15? They're still learning to count to 1 to 5, but we need something with a bit more age-appropriateness. There are lots of pieces of software out there which will help you. I mean, the obvious one that most people tend to use is things like PowerPoint or Switch It Maker 2. That's another good example, where we can use a simple framework to create resources to support our teaching, but using images and sounds which are appropriate to the age and to the needs of the students that we're working with. Technology also helps us to backward chain things as well. For people who don't know what backward chaining is, I guess most people do. It's just about breaking a task down into smaller parts. And for Chris would manage most of a task that I would give him. Stephen might just manage one tiny part of that. But breaking it down into small steps and small bits which would challenge each of them. And technology allows us to do that. Martin's different. Martin's a young man who has quite severe cerebral palsy, and for him, he uses a switch. And like many young people with cerebral palsy, he's quite lazy. He's not very keen on doing things for himself. Technology was one of those ways in which we re-engaged Martin with the learning process. We created some very simple activities. Some of them are on the Priory Woods website, which Martin really enjoyed. He enjoyed pressing a switch, making wonderful things happen on the computer, getting his teacher to get up and dance, and it was very, very effective in engaging Martin in the process again. Like many kids with CP, pressing a switch is really difficult for Martin. He has to put a huge amount of effort into it. So we need to make sure that effort is, we offer him a similar kind of, a similar reward of the same magnitude. So if he puts in a lot of effort, we give him a great reward. So early cause and effect activities, certainly when we're using switches, are very, very useful in that. For Martin too, we use technology like Switch It Maker to create personalised things, storybooks which were about him, again re-engaging him with the process, and produce teaching systems and resources which are motivating, more meaningful and memorable. Without a switch and without that technology, I've met lots of older kids with CP who by and large just switched off. They're not really interested at all with doing things for themselves. Technology can be a way which can really re-engage people with that process. For John's use of technology, John is a very young man, has quite severe intellectual difficulty. John's never going to be writing complex sentences or anything. In fact, by the time I'd left school, he was barely able to write his name. However, John could use that camera to take photographs. He could take the disk out of that camera, connect it to the computer, get all of his pictures onto the computer, make value judgments about which picture communicated information and the information that he wanted to put in his story, sequence them, and put them into a document. He could then even record a very simple narration over the top of that and create his own talking storybook. Yet when we give him a pencil, he can barely make marks with it. Technology provides us with new tools to do things and it's important, certainly for kids like John, that we give them those opportunities. 10 or 15 years ago, John would spend most of his life learning how to use a pencil. Now John can go out and use video and sound and photographs and share his ideas, his knowledge and understanding of the world, his ideas, and with lots of different people in a way that he couldn't before. I'm going to just move to the last slide now. This is Peter, and for Peter, AT was his only tool. For technology will be and is the only way that Peter can interact with the world. Peter came to our school. He was 9, and he was run over by a huge truck on his way home from school. He spent a long time in hospital and suffered from a very severe brain injury which left him quadriplegic and functioning at less than 3 months was the official paperwork that came with Peter when he came to school. Like many young people with complex needs, he's quite easy for me to borrow. So in my understanding of how switches work, I used Peter. Peter and I worked together to understand how switches work. I found out quite quickly that Peter could press a switch with his knee, that he had some movement still in his knee. And we connected that up and used a very simple cause and effect software. He pressed it, something happened on the screen, and we seen some excitement and some some happiness from Peter for being able to do that independently. Quickly understood that, so we created a very simple pop-up system where something popped up on the screen, and when he saw it, Peter pressed the switch with his knee and was able to do that and do that independently. Peter, like many children that we work with, had quite unusual taste in music. He liked Dolly Parton. Not quite sure why he liked Dolly Parton until I spoke to his mum. His mum liked country music, and that's what's playing in his house all the time. So often when we're thinking about children with complex needs and we think about what we might need in order to motivate them, it's good advice to talk to their parents. Once Peter did that, we kind of figured, well, there's more to Peter than actually what we think. So maybe Peter could choose, so he created a very simple system where we put 3 things on the screen and it scanned between them. One was Dolly Parton, one was Luciano Pavarotti, and the next one was another country singer, and Peter consistently chose the country music as opposed to the opera music. So it was demonstrating that he really did understand all of this. So the next thing for Peter was to try him with an on-screen keyboard, and we used a very simple single switch step scan, set it up to work for him, explained to him how it worked. It scanned through the letters. I asked him what he was going to write, and he wrote the word letter with 1 T. And I said, well, who are you going to write a letter to? He wrote Mom. And in that moment it demonstrated that Peter was still inside his body, just his body didn't work for him anymore. Peter didn't have any mechanism to express what was inside his body because he wasn't able to do that anymore. So we quickly found out that Peter was able to have good control over his head. We bought a head pointing system, and you can see there on the screen some little bits of software that he wrote in PowerPoint to help train that head pointing movement. Peter did really well with that. In fact, he did so well that when he moved to high school with support, he was able to go on and take exams. He now has a very sophisticated communication system that he uses, and the last I heard was he was in college and doing very well in college too. For kids like Peter, the technology facilitates pretty much everything that they do, and it's really important for us as educators that we recognise that and make sure that children like Peter, in fact all of the children that we work with, have opportunities to use that technology throughout the day. It's no longer good enough, certainly in schools in the UK, to use technology for 45 minutes a week in our ICT lesson. It has to be embedded in every single thing that we do. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for